Good morning. My name is Victoria, and I'm a partner here at Mercy View. And today we'll be reading from 1 Samuel chapter 29 and chapter 30, verses 1 through 15. If you don't have a Bible, there are blue Bibles underneath your chairs. Please feel free to take one home with you. It's our gift to you. So we'll be on page 144 in those blue Bibles, starting in chapter 29, verse 1. Now the Philistines had gathered all their forces at Aphek, and the Israelites were encamped by the spring that is in Jezreel. And the lords of the Philistines were passing on by hundreds and by thousands, and David and his men were passing on in the rear with Achish. The commanders of the Philistines said, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" And Achish said to the commanders of the Philistines, "Is this not David, the servant of Saul, king of Israel, who has been with me now for days and years? And since he deserted to me, I have found no fault in him to this day." But the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him. And the commanders of the Philistines said to him, "Send the man back, that he may return to the place to which you have assigned him." "He shall not go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he become an adversary to us. For how could this fellow reconcile himself to his Lord? Would it not be with the heads of the men here? Is not this David, of whom they sing to one another in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Then Achish called David and said to him, "As the Lord lives, you have been honest, and to me it seems right that you should march out and end with me in the campaign. For I have found nothing wrong in you from the day of your coming to me to this day. Nevertheless, the lords do not approve of you. So go back now, and go peaceably, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines." And David said to Achish, "But what have I done? What have you found in your servant from the day I entered your service until now, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" And Achish answered David and said, "I know that you are as blameless in my sight as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said, 'He shall not go up with us to the battle.' Now then, rise early in the morning with the servants of your Lord who came with you, and start early in the morning and depart as soon as you have light." Skip down to chapter 30, starting in verse 1. Now when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day, the Amalekites had made a raid against the Negeb and against Ziklag. They had overcome Ziklag and burned it with fire, and taken captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They killed no one, but carried them off and went their way. And when David and his men came to the city, they found it burned with fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. David's 2 wives also had been taken captive, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. And David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, "Bring me the ephod." So Abiathar brought the ephod to David. And David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I pursue after this band? Shall I overtake them?" He answered them, "Pursue, for you shall surely overtake and shall surely rescue." So David set out, and the 600 men who were with him. And they came to the brook Bezor, where those who were left behind stayed. But David pursued, he and 400 men. 200 stayed behind, who were too exhausted to cross the brook Bezor. They found an Egyptian in the open country and brought him to David, and they gave him bread, and he ate. They gave him water to drink, and they gave him a piece of a cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. And when he had eaten, his spirit revived, for he had not eaten bread or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. And David said to him, "To whom do you belong, and where are you from?" He said, "I am a young man of Egypt, servant to an Amalekite. And my master left me behind because I fell sick 3 days ago. We had made a raid against the Negeb of the Kerethites and against that which belongs to Judah and against the Negeb of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire. And David said to him, "Will you take me down to this band?" And he said, "Swear to me by God that you will not kill me or deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will take you down to this band." This is the word of the Lord.
Well, the great Puritan Thomas Brooks once said this: "Hope can see heaven through the thickest clouds." Now, what I think Brooks meant by that is that in our lives, when difficulty and doubt begin to creep in, or even more so, they begin to hang very heavy in our lives, hope is, according to Brooks, the divine telescope that reveals the bright, unshakable promise of glory. In other words, hope doesn't deny the clouds, right? We're not like acting like they're not there, but it is the ability to see through them and even past them. It's the confident, supernatural vision that sees beyond the circumstances that we find ourselves in to what's on the other side of the clouds. You know this. What is on the other side of the clouds? It's actually blue skies, it's sunshine, but as we think about this spiritually, as we see beyond our circumstances, we are looking then to the eternal sunrise. Or said another way, Brooks is saying that God, in his faithfulness, can give us a hope that transcends our present struggles. There is no cloud that can hide his glory. If we are using the divine telescope idea, hope, in other words, is not something that ever totally and finally rests in our circumstances, but in God's unchanging character and in his eternal plan. So why do we so often fail to see God's hope this way? Why do we let our circumstances dictate our confidence rather than allowing God's character to shape our perspective? Why is it when the clouds start to gather and they start to get really thick that we quickly forget that hope is the clear sight of God's promises no matter how thick the clouds may seem? Have we really come to believe that our doubts and our fears and our pain are bigger than God's faithfulness? What would it look like to shift our gaze from the storm to the Savior? To fix our eyes on the eternal sunrise instead of the temporary clouds. We are in the second to last sermon in a series that we have been in the book of 1 Samuel for quite some time now. The series is called In Search of a King, and next week we'll close shop on 1 Samuel. Amazing, 1 Samuel 31. But today we're looking at a couple of chapters together as we come to the finish line of this book in 1 Samuel 29 and 30. And I want to invite you to see two things in these chapters today as we walk through this. First is this: God's providence often creates conditions for your renewed hope. Let me just say that again. God's providence often creates the conditions, if we'll respond to them rightly, for your renewed hope. And then secondly, God's encouragement strengthens our faith to see beyond current circumstances. God's encouragement to us is meant to strengthen our faith to see beyond our current circumstances, or to use Thomas Brooks's language, to see beyond the thickest clouds. So if you have your Bibles or electronic devices, keep them open to 1 Samuel chapter 29. That's where we'll begin this morning. And as you're looking back there, let's just kind of remember where we came from. Last week, Jacob took us through 1 Samuel 27 and 28. And we saw two men that have been connected throughout this whole book, David and Saul. And Saul is in chapter 28. But in both of these chapters, what we really see is two men driven by despair that led to disobedience and ultimately compromise. Now, their despair, the reasons for their despair, the ways in which they disobeyed God had different shapes. But one faltered in weakness, the other in pride. But what we saw in both of them is that their despair was untethered from faith. And this is what we learned last week. When we live that way, when we let our despair be untethered from faith in God, it often leads us away from God. And that's what disobedience is. Disobedience is not moving towards God, it's moving away from God, right? It's not trusting that God is good and his ways are good. And so we continue this week as we move into 1 Samuel 29. And it's interesting because in verse 1 of 1 Samuel 29, the Philistine war machine is revving again. And then as we move into verse 2, the story actually backtracks to 1 Samuel 28, verse 2, that we were in last week, where the Philistines are still basically at their gathering point in a place called Aphek. And at this gathering spot, the lords of the Philistines, which would have been like the leaders of the 5 major Philistine cities, are gathering their armies for a final clash with Saul. Now, David, in this part of our chapter, is still in the enemy's ranks. That's something we saw last week. That was kind of interesting, right? I mean, David, the Israelite, has joined ranks with the enemy, and we still see that is the case here, because remember, we're backtracking into actually 1 Samuel 28. He's still in the enemy's ranks. He's marching at the rear of the army with the king of Gath, Achish. But look there, verse 3. The other Philistine commanders are not buying that David, the Israelite, is really with them. And this makes sense to me. They see David like a Trojan horse, or better, maybe a Hebrew horse, who could turn on them in battle. And Achish tries to defend David there in verse 3, but the instincts of the commanders, I think rightly so, are revealed. They look at verse 5. Here's something that I think gives us a window into that. They remember the old war songs. This isn't the first time we've heard this in the book. Saul has struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s. Who were the 10,000s? Philistines, mostly Philistines. And so the leaders of these other Philistine cities are saying to Achish, like, hey man, you're being deceived. You've got this wrong. David is not with us. They tell him to send David back to where he came from there in verse 4. And so then look with me at verse 6. Achish delivers that news to David with almost, it's like comedic, like a comedic level of sincerity. I mean, here you have a polytheistic king swearing as the Lord lives that David has been honest with him. He hasn't. He's actually been raiding the Philistines secretly behind Achish's back. Down in verse 9, Achish calls David as blameless as an angel of God. And this is all deeply ironic to me. Achish is blind to the fact that David is actively deceiving him. And in fact, look there at verse 8. David attempts to make one more plea that he has never wronged Achish. But Achish honors the other Philistine leaders, and he tells David in verse 10 to pack his bags and to leave in the morning, and David does just that at the very end of this chapter in verse 11. Now, I want you to notice something very important. This might feel like a throwaway chapter, but it's not. The Philistine leaders had concerns about David, and it ended up being more than just a suspicion. I know that they were concerned about maybe how David could turn on them, but notice what's happening from God's perspective. Through, this is amazing, pagan generals, God rescues David. Listen, he providentially safeguards David. Like, God is orchestrating something here that we don't want to miss. David's exit from here, at this point, the Philistines' ranks, is not just an escape. It's actually, we're going to see this, it becomes a return to his true calling. And as we move into 2 Samuel later this year, you're going to see how that starts to take shape. But look with me, if you would, at verse 11 there at the end of 1 Samuel 29. Let me just read that for us. It says, David set out with his men early in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines, but the Philistines went up to Jezreel. So here's what's happening at this point. The action is going to split moving forward. 1 Samuel 30, which we're getting ready to look at, is going to show us David's story. And then next week, we're going to look at Saul's story in 1 Samuel 31. But this is the moment where these stories kind of split. And so, if you would, as we keep in mind, then we're looking at David's story. Look with me at 1 Samuel chapter 30, beginning in verse 1. David is returning to a city that he's actually lived in before. He's actually spent over a year living there, a city called Ziklag. And if you remember back in 1 Samuel 27, this city was like a temporary refuge for David. Achish had given this city to him, and it was kind of an in-between space, actually, where David was trying to figure out the tension between faithfulness to God and being in political exile. It became really a base of operations for him. One of the raids that he carries out during this time is going to come into play here in just a moment. But I want you to look there at what David returns to see in the city that he used to live in. It was a horrifying scene. The city had been burnt to the ground, and everyone that lived there, everyone, had been taken captive by a group of people called the Amalekites. Now, this isn't the first time we've heard of the Amalekites in 1 Samuel. Back in 1 Samuel 15, you'll remember the infamous story of King Saul being commanded by God to utterly destroy them. And instead of doing what God told him to do, he actually disobeys God, spares the king of the Amalekites named Agag and some of their best livestock. This was a part of Saul's downturn and ruin as a leader. But also back in 1 Samuel 27, David lived, like I said, in Ziklag for over a year. And it was during this time that one of the raids that David carries out is against, you guessed it, the Amalekites. So as David returns to Ziklag here in 1 Samuel 30, it's clear to me that David's raids against them had stirred the hornet's nest. What he has come upon is the result of a revenge raid against him. Are you with me? All right. So here David is actually reaping the consequences of his own compromise. What's the compromise? David had joined the Philistines. He had joined the enemy. In fact, down in verse 5, if you look there, it says that David's 2 wives had been taken captive as well. So this has quickly become very personal. It's like the very beginning. You guys have seen this trope in a movie or a television show where, like, the protagonist's family is harmed, and the rest of that show is like that person unleashing with righteous fury all that they can against the enemy. That is the vibe here for David in Ziklag. Now, I do need to say, just as a sidebar here, you heard me just say David's 2 wives. And we've said this, but we said this actually at the very beginning of this book as we talked about Samuel. But what you see when something like this is said in the Bible, it is a description, not a prescription, of what is just happening in David's life. It is not a way in which to sort of like say that God is sort of winking his eye at something that is not really okay. He is actually just, the writer here is actually describing something. And maybe I could just say it this way. What a father does always sets up a model for his children to pattern after. And if you know the story of Solomon, one of David's children, he sets David sets Solomon up for what would become a even bigger fall. Like, when Solomon becomes king, he takes on many, many, many more wives. And so we have this tension here, even as we look at this, and you're going to see this, you see this in the Psalms that David wrote himself. You're going to see this in 2 Samuel. God will forgive David. And David repents well. But you know this, the consequence of sin, the consequences of sin are often themselves unforgiving. We still have to go through them, and we actually will see that not only in David's life, but also in his son's life in Solomon. But before David ever draws his sword to get back at the Amalekites, I want you to see what happens. Look with me at verse 4. The text says that David and his men wept until they had no more strength to weep. So their immediate response wasn't, let's go get the Amalekites. Their immediate response was lament. And don't miss this, these weren't soft men, all right? Like the people that the writer is describing here are battled, hardened warriors. The kind who don't flinch at blood. But here they are absolutely undone. They've been brought to their knees by the grief of stolen wives and missing children and ashes where their lives once stood. And they don't just cry. I mean, they cry. But they cry so much that they run out of tears. They cry until they can't cry anymore. Grief did what an army against them could never do. It crumbled them to the ground. And not only that, in verse 6 we see something happen because of the grief. Look there with me. David's men, the men who had went with him, ridden with him into countless battles, their lament, their sadness, their grief begins to mutate into something called blame. The very man who had ridden with him into countless battles, the very men who had done that with David want to turn on him now. They want to stone him. That means they want to kill him. That's just how deep the anguish ran for David's men. They felt they needed a scapegoat. They wanted someone to blame, to make sense of the grief that they were feeling. These men weren't just angry at their loss. They were desperate for justice. And they thought that someone or something had to answer for the devastation that they felt. And for them, David was the closest target. Now look with me at verses 7 and 8. How does David respond to this? David, as he's done often in 1 Samuel, seeks the Lord to ask him if he should go after the Amalekites. And here we see, again, David's spiritual resilience. He does not rely on human wisdom. He does not rely on raw vengeance. He does not look for someone to blame or to make a scapegoat. He instead seeks God. He seeks God's guidance. And you see the answer comes quickly from God. Yes, I want you to pursue them, and you'll find victory, and you'll recover everything. So in verses 9 and 10, David sets out with 400 men to take on the Amalekites. But I want you to notice on their way there, listen, another providential thing happens. In verses 11 through 15, David comes upon a famished Egyptian servant. And because David had compassion on him, he stops to give him some food, to give him some water. He hadn't eaten or drank anything for like 3 days, the scriptures say. And this small act of mercy from David to the Egyptian turns out to be pivotal, because the servant is so grateful for the kindness that David showed him, he leads David directly to the Amalekite camp. And look there, verses 16 through 19. David strikes at the most opportune moment. Also a providential thing here to me. Catching the Amalekites in the aftermath of their own feast of the defeat of David and his men. So the Amalekites are utterly routed in this moment, and David recovers everything that they had taken, just like God said they would. His wives, his men's families, and it says all the plunder that was taken from them. It says that nothing was missing. That's a pretty significant word. Nothing was missing. The detour with the Egyptian servant actually became a divine setup for victory. Are you with me? Okay, so look with me there at verse 20, because I think we see something happen in the hearts of the men, David's men, who wanted to blame someone or something. The great English pastor and preacher Charles Spurgeon, in his sermon, he preached a sermon just on this one verse once. And he points out something so profound. Here's what Spurgeon said. He said, David's men, in the moment of their despair, had spoken of stoning him. But now in the morning of their victory, they determined that David shall have as his portion of the spoil all the cattle which belong to the Amalekites themselves. And listen to what Spurgeon says. He says, I think I can hear them as they drive the bullocks and the sheep before them, shouting right lustily, this is David's spoil. Now, why did David's men say it that way? They could have just said, hey, this is our spoil. It was, in many ways, collectively like everybody's. But what I want you to notice is that the very men who were ready to turn on him in anger are now leading the charge to ensure that David gets his share. Why? Because they recognize that David has led them out of their sorrow to hope. Here's Spurgeon again from that same sermon. David's men gained the victory over Amalek because of David's leadership. If he had not been there to lead them to the fight, in the moment of their despair, they would have lost all heart and would have remained amidst the burning walls of Ziklag. Drawing his sword and marching in front, David put spirit into them. They all followed with eager step because their leaders so courageously led the way. I think what we're witnessing here in the aftermath of the victory is, listen, in David, a real king. Not just any king, right? Not like Saul, the people of Israel, when Saul became king, they wanted a king who was like the other kings of the other nations. This is a different kind of king. We're witnessing a kind of king that doesn't just merely reign over his people to just win battles. He wins the loyalty and the hearts of those he leads by winning their hearts. And now in the triumph of victory, as his men are shouting, this is David's spoil, what they're really declaring is, this is our king. They know that none of this would have been possible without their leader's strength, without his resolve, without his unwavering trust in God. And their hearts, once full of bitterness, are now swelling with respect and esteem for David. And not only that, we see the kind of king that he is going to become. We didn't say this earlier, but there were actually 600 men that David had with him. And as you heard earlier, only 400 of them went with him into battle. There were 200 that stayed back. They were exhausted. They were tired. They did have a job. They were watching the baggage, which I think was, that's a decent job. Like, it wasn't they were just sleeping, okay? They had a job. But for those 200 men that stayed back, in verse 21, David shares the spoils with them. And not only that, it says that he sends parts of the spoil to his friends, the elders of Judah. Now, on the one hand, this was a strategic and political move in a sense. Like, David is attempting to secure his future by making alliances and sowing trust with other leaders. But there's more than that going on here. And when I mean that we're beginning to see the kind of king that David is and is becoming, the sharing of the spoils was an act of grace, showing that his future reign would be marked by generosity and mercy. So, what are we supposed to see in these two chapters this morning? Here's the first thing I want to invite you to see. You heard me say this earlier. God's providence often creates the conditions for your renewed hope. Do you remember how the divine providence has worked in our story today, right? First, David is saved not by his own wisdom, but by the distrust of the Philistine commanders. His apparent rejection by them is actually a redirection by God. It's the providence of God. And that kind of providence actually echoes all throughout the scriptures. I can think of a couple of examples. Joseph, sold into slavery only to be elevated to leadership in Egypt. Moses fleeing the wilderness before leading Israel to freedom. It's all over the place. In other words, what looked like rejection in the life of Joseph or Moses or even David here in our story is often, listen, preparation. But the second providential thing that we saw in our story today is David being detoured by the Egyptian servant, right? Who ends up being the very key to their victory. So what looks like a detour here is actually a red carpet rolled out by God to lead David straight to the Amalekites. In both of these instances, God's sovereign hand is at work. And it's not that God is just sort of behind the scenes doing stuff. He is in a sense, but like he's rewriting the scenes. The very things that look like setbacks in our story today were sovereign setups for renewed hope. And it's all found in this theological, doctrinal idea of the providence of God. Now, you may be here this morning, and you may feel that you are standing in the midst of wreckage. And you are asking, where are you, God? Where are you in this? And I get it. Sometimes life has a way of tearing through our plans like a tornado here in Oklahoma can. And when that happens, hopes collapse for you. Dreams burn to ash, and all you have left, it feels like, is smoke in your lungs and questions in your heart. And I'm sure that's what David and his men felt as they looked at the town they lived in burnt to the ground and their families gone. What they felt in that moment, we feel when life doesn't make sense to us. When what we thought was supposed to happen, when everything familiar seems like it has now been scorched or stolen. Often what we feel in this moment, it seems like God is silent. It seems like God is absent. Or worse, it seems like God is uninterested. And these moments feel like gut punches. And they come with real grief, real tears, real confusion, real disorientation. When the loss comes to us, and when the sadness overtakes us, let's just be really honest. We never really feel like we're being positioned for hope. We feel abandoned. We feel forgotten. We feel stuck, right? And for many of us, it can feel like the story has absolutely stopped. And no one has bothered to write the next page. But I just want you to hang with me here for just a moment. What if, just like we see in the story of David today, that the very thing that appears to be a setback is actually the staging ground for something greater? Could it be that the very thing that you're struggling with, maybe even resenting, is the road God is using to bring redemption to you? Renewed hope. Could it be that the detour, the dead end, the heartbreak, the loss, the grief are actually a part of, not disconnected from, but a part of the map that God wants you to journey through and on? See, David didn't plan for Philistine rejection. He didn't plan to stumble into a half-dead Egyptian servant in a field. But those two things that happen in our story today were, listen, the hinges on which everything turned in our stories today. The smoke and the ruin were not the end of the story for David. The author and perfecter of David's faith had not put down his pen, friend. It takes faith to look at your grief and say, God, I don't get it, but I trust that you're not done writing. See, God calls you to that, to lift your head and to not only ask. It's okay to ask some of these questions, but not to stop here, but don't just stop with, why me, God? Or how could this happen? Or will this ever end? But then to begin to move towards asking God, what are you doing in this? What might you be preparing me for? Is this, God, a moment where you're reshaping me into something more faithful, more mature? Let me ask it this way. Could it be that the tears that you cry now are actually watering future joy, future hope? One of the most difficult things, I think, for us to wrap our heads around and our hearts around is this idea that God is at work always, even in really difficult moments. Or to say it how we just said it, God's providence often is creating the conditions for us to find hope, renewed hope. And what we see in our passage today is that sometimes God's providence feels like rejection. Sometimes God's providence feels like a detour. And can we be honest? We don't like that. In other words, we want God's plans for us to be clear, to be smooth, to be comfortable. We don't want it to have to involve any change on our part. Like, God, just do it. Make it easy. Like, we crave the easy way. I do. But listen, God is always more concerned with shaping you than giving you smooth sailing. And when it comes to God's providence, if what we're looking for when we're seeing God at work, and maybe it's hard, if what we're looking for is a promotion, then we're not seeing what's happening in our passages today. Our passage today asks us this: can you trust God when it feels like detours or even dead ends lead you to places that you would never go on your own? Because if we can, with integrity, ask that of our hearts, know that God might be leading us into places that we wouldn't have chosen on our own, we begin to, though, find that God begins to answer us and say, I'm doing this so that you can discover things you would have never learned otherwise. The road for some of you might be really rough today. But as we look at our story today, we see that if we trust God, if we place our trust and faith in Him, we'll find ourselves exactly where we need to be. And in the midst of struggle, He can renew our hope in Him and for our future. But there's a second thing I want to invite you to see this morning from our passage, and it's the second thing I mentioned earlier. It's this: God's encouragement strengthens our faith to see beyond current circumstances. Now, it might sound like we've already said that this morning, but I want to actually point you to something we skipped over earlier. Look with me at 1 Samuel 30, verse 6. Let me just read that for us again. It says, "And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters." And then I want you to notice this: "But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God." Remember, in our story, when David's men are turning on him, right, their hearts are bitter. Their hearts are broken from the loss around them. And now David, their leader, becomes the target of their anger. So much so that they started talking about killing him by throwing stones at him. And again, we said this, but Everything seemed to be going wrong. They thought they needed someone or something to blame, and so David was that person for them. All that they saw in the moment was their sadness, their grief, their suffering, and so they lashed out. And in that moment of betrayal and loss, David could have been defeated by that personally. Man, I would be tempted to in that moment. But instead, David chose to do something that we need to do too. In fact, some translations say that David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. That is what David chose to do in this moment of real struggle. So what does it mean that David strengthened himself in the Lord? Well, it means this. David did not wait for the storm to pass before he found strength, pursued strength from the Lord. Like he didn't wait for the people around him to come and help him make sense of this, or even for his circumstances to change. In the midst of his men who had went with him in battle wanting to stone him, David turned to God. In that moment, when all the voices around him were full of blame, David chose to quiet the noise by listening to the quiet but mighty voice of God inside of him, strengthening himself in the Lord. It reminds me of the great quote, you may have heard it before, by the great British pastor and preacher at Westminster Chapel in London in the mid-20th century, Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones. Here's what he said. Have you realized that most of your unhappiness in life is due to the fact that you are listening to yourself instead of talking to yourself? Take those thoughts that come to you the moment you wake up in the morning. You have not originated them, but they are talking to you. They bring back the problems of yesterday. And isn't that true, right? And he closes it by saying, somebody is talking in that moment. But who is talking to you? Yourself is talking to you. And then referencing Psalm 42, Lloyd-Jones says that in that psalm we see David doing this very thing when he says, why so downcast, O my soul, put your hope in God. David's talking to himself. Now, do you see what Lloyd-Jones is trying to communicate here? He is saying that instead of allowing his circumstances to talk to him, David starts talking to himself. And he says, self, just listen for a moment. I'm going to speak to you. And so what does David say? Well, here's Spurgeon again on what David did in 1 Samuel 30, verse 6, echoing what Lloyd-Jones is saying. It says, standing amidst those ruins, he would say, my experience of divine love is not a dream. It is not a myth or a delusion. I have known the Lord. And I know that he changes not, and therefore he will help me. His mercy endureth forever. And then, as if Spurgeon is speaking to us, this is him speaking to his congregation in London. Spurgeon says this to us too. Come now, dear children of God. Refer to the days when the Lord helped you again and again. How many times has he blessed you? You could not count them. For God has been so gracious and tender that he has aided you 10,000 times already. Has he changed in love, in faithfulness, in power? God forbid that we should indulge such a wicked thought. He is still the same, and so let us encourage ourselves in him. Fear not the storm. It brings healing in its wings, and when Jesus is with you in the vessel, the tempest only hastens the ship to its desired haven. Blessed be the Lord, whose way is in the whirlwind, and who makes the clouds to be the dust of his feet. See, David reminded himself who he was in God. And it was this truth that propelled him forward. And friend, that's true for you too. Can be. When life hits hard, we often do what David's men did. We start to look for someone or something to blame. When life feels unfair, when you felt deep loss and deep pain and deep grief, it's tempting to let the confusion and the fog and the bitterness that maybe is starting to grow sink into your soul and let it become the soundtrack of your life. But I would argue that if you're doing that, you're letting the circumstances talk to you. David could have let his men's venom crush him. Again, I think it would have been hard for me in that moment. But instead, David strengthened his heart in God. See, we live in a world that whispers, sometimes shouts to us, wallow in your misery. Like, you deserve to be angry. The pain will never end, so why even bother to keep fighting for hope? But David's example to us is this: preach to yourself. Talk to your own soul. Remind yourself of who God is. Speak truth over your despair. Tell your heart, hope is never lost with God. Declare His promises, even when your mind doubts. Like, what would it look like for us if we did that? If we started speaking truth to ourselves instead of letting circumstances speak more loudly to us? Again, I recognize our circumstances can be very difficult sometimes. But what if today you chose to preach to yourself more, even when everything around you says things seem hopeless? David preached to himself, and so should we. We should preach to ourselves, God is my refuge and my strength, a very present help in times of trouble. And the reason that promise can be we can stand on that promise is because just in the same way that David's men made the turn and saw David as their king, we have a king. The one whom we say is our refuge and our strength, a very present help in a time of trouble, is not just like any king. It's not the kind of king that just sort of reigns over people, just wins battles. We actually have a king who's won our hearts because of what He's done for us through the cross. And so we know, we should, if you're a believer here this morning, that it's because of Jesus that we can find renewed hope. And we can also begin to see that God is working things out, even in the midst of real difficulty. Why? Because King Jesus, His reign is a reign of generosity and mercy. And we can rest deeply in that. We need to preach to ourselves, even when everything around us, that truth, we need to preach that truth to us, even when everything around us seems hopeless. Our circumstances can be difficult, but they do not have the final word. God does. So let's preach to ourselves in the days to come that God is in control. That His providence, though at times may be hard, is a part of His preparation for renewed hope and our renewed future. We have a king to follow in this. And this king is a king who made the ultimate sacrifice for us so that we would be able to follow Him and say, that is our king. Let's pray together.